Good day to my 8th grade students. I'd like to, I understand the previous video did not come out clearly in certain parts, and a particularly important part, which therefore I'm going to reiterate today, which is the question Rabbi Moshe Feinstein asked about why the descendants of these people who were being so moser nefesh, sacrificed so much to be Shomer Shabbos, did not themselves remain Shomer Shabbos. And I found it in a quote, which I'm going to read to you now, more or less. It says, many Yidden had great difficulty holding down jobs, as they were made to work on Shabbos, and hence had to give up their jobs. They were moser nefesh for Shabbos in a great way. However, many of their children assimilated into the American life and left the ways of their parents. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was asked how this could happen when these children saw how much it meant to their parents to keep the mitzvos. He replied that they did it with a krechts. A krechts is a groan, and not besimcha. In other words, when the fellow came back from his long work week with long hours Friday afternoon to make Shabbos, he said, "Oi, we have to keep Shabbos." Suppose saying, wonderful, now we're going to be able to keep Shabbos. Our challenge is to do the mitzvahs b'simcha and show by example how wonderful and exciting life can be for Torah observant Jews. That's the commentary from the author of that piece. But the point is that, yes, if you show that Torah Judaism is good and valuable and pleasant and uplifting, then you're going to be able to pass it on to future generations. If you show it to be difficult, a strain, a burden, and something which is constantly in jeopardizing your parnasa, then you're probably not going to be able to pass it on to the next generation. Now, we mentioned last week the problems of kashrus. So, I'm sorry, those of you who did not write that down properly, which I think is just about everybody last week, please make sure to write it down today. What Rabbi Moshe Feinstein said about they having done it with a krechts is spelled krechts, K-R-E-C-H-T-S, as opposed to besimcha. Now, in order to talk about kashrus in America, we have to give a little bit of an overview of the kashrus industry, particularly as it connects to, it's not the word I'm looking for, particularly in regard to meat. Now, chickens used to be shechted at the butcher store. There was no Empire plant way in Pennsylvania where chickens are shechted. Everything was done in the butcher store. And it is said that in the early 20th century, when the people, the late 19th century, early 20th century, the shechtim on Erev Shabbos would shecht so many thousands of chickens that when they came home for Shabbos, they were not able to lift their hands. They couldn't move their hands because they were so exhausted and so, I'm sure, so sore from shechting so many chickens that day. So you can imagine how careful and meticulous they would be if they were shechting thousands of chickens a day in order to provide the masses with chicken for Shabbos. There was tremendous pressure on them to shecht many more chickens and many more chickens in order to meet the demand. But let's also talk about meat cows specifically. Now, as you may know or may not know, and if you don't know, you should know it and write it down, we in Chutz La'aretz, usually, at least among the Ashkenazim, usually only eat the 4 quarters of an animal. That means up to the end of the animal's rib cage. The back of an animal, which is where most of the fancy cuts of meat, which if you don't keep kosher, you can eat, such as sirloin steak, filet mignon, a bunch of other cuts of meat, where those are located, we don't use. Now, it's not that we can't use them, but it's not cost effective, and the minute we came not to use them because it took too much time and too much labor. Why is that? Because in order to eat an animal, specifically a cow, you have to do what's called Niqua. Niqua means to cut out. And you have to cut out the chalev. We're doing the parashas of Vayikra now. Most of the forbidden fats are in the back of the animal, not in the front of the animal. So therefore, the chalev, which you have in your chayav kares, has to be carefully removed, and it's a time-consuming and difficult thing to remove the chalev in the back of the animal, where it's plentiful, as opposed to the front of the animal, where there's barely any. That's A. B. Then in the back of the animal, you have the gid hanoshe, the sciatic nerve, and the gid hanoshe requires a tremendous amount of intensive labor in order to remove it and it's a nerve. So the nerve branches off into the meat in many different places. Just like your nerves have to branch off in your body in order for you to be able to feel things all over. So it was a tremendous amount of labor to remove the gid hanoshe. And in fact, the truly expensive cuts of meat, which like sirloin and filet mignon and other rump meat from the rump of the animal, they could come out after Niqua more like chopped meat than like a steak, because of all the everything you have to remove. Besides that, there's also blood vessels to remove. That's also part of Niqua, because of course blood, although once you cook blood, it's not a chiyuv kares, but nevertheless it's also to have blood. So therefore, we have to remove those blood vessels. There are a lot of them in the front of the animal, but they're not so hard to do. Sometimes you cut them open, remove the blood. That's okay. Or sometimes you slide them out. By the way, I should tell you, Niqua also has a different name. It's called in Yiddish. Sometimes you'll hear this. Now, I'm telling you this because I learned these things. Nobody taught me these terms, so I only learned them the hard way. So maybe for you it's going to be easy someday. Trayburing. Don't ask me why. That's what it's called in Yiddish. Trayburing is the term for Niqua in Yiddish. So, as a result, there was no Jewish slaughterhouse. And in America, until Rubashkin came along in the scene in, if I recall correctly, the late 80s or mid-80s, in Postville, Iowa. There was no, because it's not economical to have a Jewish slaughterhouse, because half of the animal you have to sell to non-Jews, right? And the amount of cows which you have, which are treif, you also have to sell to non-Jews. So therefore, you're not necessarily making enough product to run your own slaughterhouse. In fact, Rubashkin in the end went under because of the economic pressure of trying to run a kosher slaughterhouse and make a profit. So the shechita was done, and still is done for the most part, in non-Jewish slaughterhouses, where the shechita either rents out space, or in the old days, where the slaughterhouse itself, for the profit of the Jewish trade, allocated part of its a run or a part of its slaughterhouse to the kosher meat industry. Now, this led to all sorts of corruption, because the non-Jewish owners of the slaughterhouses were only interested in profit. They couldn't care less about the quality of the kashrus. That was not a selling point back then, because the people who came to America were not, I guess, let's put this on the line, it all depends how frum the housewives are. The men, they don't determine what's purchased. It's the women. So the women at that time, if you recall, there was no strong Jewish education for women, and women just wanted to be able to feed their families. They weren't as concerned with kashrus as later on developed on the American scene. So therefore, there was a tremendous amount of pressure to shecht and make more money and pay less attention to the kashrus. Another problem, because so far we have, remember, taking notes, even though I'm not telling you to take the notes. So the back of the back of the animal and all that, which we mentioned, you should remember that. Now, another problem in kashrus was that although the OU, the Orthodox Union, was founded in the 1890s, it didn't get into kashrus until the 1930s. And there was, until the 1930s, there was basically no such thing as a community kashrus symbol or as a community kashrus organization. Every Rav would give a hechsher on whatever he was able to give a hechsher on, because much of his income came from the kashrus industry. There was a very, very distinguished rabbi in Omaha, Nebraska. His name was Rabbi Gojensky, and you don't have to write that down. And he was out there because that's where the cattle were. And he was giving hechsherim to slaughter, which took place in Omaha and other places nearby. And these were usually, this is a problem for American Jewry in general, because usually these rabbis at the time were not even capable of speaking English. They couldn't relate to their congregants except in Yiddish, because their main income and their main pursuit was kashrus, and they didn't really get into trying to be makari people or keeping people from. They were hard enough up for the kashrus part of the job. And there was heavy competition for kashrus as well, because this was how people made a parnasa. So therefore, rabbis used to compete in the big cities where there are many rabbis for the kashrus. To be the certified kashrus of usually the shechita. And another aspect of that was that the rabbis fought with each other, sometimes vehemently. And some rabbis claimed, we are more kosher. And other rabbis claimed, we can make more animals kosher. And this became a tremendous battle in early American Jewish Judaism. Now, it's redundant, sorry. In New York, an attempt was made to kind of resolve this by bringing in the first and last chief rabbi of America. And his name was Rabbi Jacob Joseph. So his real name was Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, but we usually call him Rabbi Jacob Joseph and call him for short RJJ. So Rabbi Jacob Joseph was brought in 1887 and he died in 1902. He was brought in 1887. It was the town Rabbi Soslanton, one of the Musa greats. And he was brought in to a large extent to try and bring order to the kashrus of New York. And he tried very mightily, and it killed him. Because shortly after he came, a few years after he came, he suffered a paralytic stroke, a stroke which left him paralyzed because of the tremendous pressure he was under. And one of the first things which he tried to do is to bring order and uniformity to the kashrus of chickens, the slaughter of chickens, which, if you recall, each butcher did separately. In order to do that, the community of New York came up with the idea of imposing a 1-cent tax on each chicken which was slaughtered. Now that doesn't sound like much, but it caused a tremendous uproar, because back in the old country, in Russia and Poland and so on and so forth, this kind of tax, it was called the korupka. I don't know if you remember that. Was used in order for the authorities to make money off the Jews. They used to impose food tax. They used to impose candle tax. They used to impose all sorts of taxes on Jewish practices. So therefore, this speaker was reminiscent. This reminding the population, and it was a good tool for Yiddish writers who were anti-Orthodox to use to scoff and mock and challenge the chief rabbi as being a kind of government official, corrupt government official, taking money instead of providing the service of kashrus, which should be provided for free. And as a result, there are the rabbis who jumped on the bandwagon because of this tremendous machlokas, and therefore because of the tremendous opportunities which are in the kashrus industry, and therefore this actually eventually killed him, and the problem was not solved. And there was a saying back in America, and then mir ruft dem Mendel, meg men essen von sein Fendel. And that means his name is Mendel, you can eat from his pot. Fendel's a pot. Oib mir ruft Mendel, meg men essen von sein Fendel. I want to make one other point before I stop for today. We'll continue tomorrow. Oib mir ruft Mendel meg men essen von sein Fendel. And that was one of the major problems one of the major problems with kashrus until relatively recently is that the cheapest form of shortening to use, the cheapest form, in other words, of oil to use, is lard, pig fat. And much of the problem in American kashrus was that pig fat was the way everybody greased their industrial pans to make all sorts of different things, such as cookies, because you need grease for cookies. So therefore, the kashrus is nowadays it's far less popular because it's known to be extremely unhealthy, and we're more health conscious than we used to be. But that was a big problem with buying prepared things, even the most innocuous prepared things, and therefore kashrus was a big, big problem. Okay, we will stop here for today. I should not, actually, one more thing, which is, as I mentioned before, this was not solved until the 1930s when the OU came with the kashrus, and kashrus shifted from rabbis competing to each other to large kashrus organizations, which was a major, major leap forward.